So you want to get the most amount of dynamic range from a single raw exposure just shooting with your crop sensor Fujifilm camera. What's up everyone, Reggie B Photo here and welcome back to the channel. So for those of you who are new, my name is Reggie Ballesteros and I'm a wedding photographer and Fujifilm X photographer from the San Francisco Bay Area. And in this video, I'm going to show you guys how to squeeze all the amount of dynamic range from a single raw exposure so that you can kind of expand the edit into the full tonal range of that image, especially if you're shooting in a high contrast scene such as a sunset, sunrise, and that kind of thing. But before we jump in the editing portion, I wanted to give you guys 4 tips that you need to do beforehand when you're capturing the photo to make sure that you have the best possible starting point for the edit. So the first thing you want to do is make sure you're shooting in RAW, and this is going to give you the most exposure flexibility in post. And then you also want to shoot in your native base ISO, which is going to be typically between ISO 100 to 200. For my camera, the Fujifilm X-T3, it is ISO 160. And the base ISO of your camera is going to give you the lowest amount of noise as well as the highest amount of dynamic range captured within a single photo on your particular camera model. And the other 2 tips are to make sure that you capture all the entire tonal range of the image by paying attention to your histogram. So the first thing you want to do is avoid clipping highlights on the right side of the histogram. And what you're trying to do is avoid any pure white pixels from being captured. That way you don't lose any data and you can recover kind of the highlight in post. And the best way to do that is to turn on the highlight warning of your camera. And the second part of that is to make sure that you're capturing all the shadow detail of your image. To do that, you want to make sure you're not clipping the left side or the shadow side of your image. And basically, you're trying to avoid capturing any pure black pixels. And the best way to do that is to have kind of an enlarge histogram if you have that on your camera. And I have a function button to pop up the enlarge histogram so I can make sure and see that there's no kind of clipping happening on the shadow or the left side. From there, you want to expose your image properly so that you don't have any clipping, again in RAW at your base native ISO. And then you're going to take that captured photo and we're going to jump into Lightroom and show you how to edit these types of shots. Alright, so for this particular image, I shot it with the Fujifilm X-T3. You can do this with pretty much any camera as long as you're shooting with a RAW file and again at the lowest base ISO of your camera. And to go over kind of the details of the shot, I shot it at 23mm, which is a 35mm equivalent in full frame. And it was shot at 1/6400 of a second because it's pretty bright outside. It was a sunset and at aperture f1.6 and again ISO 160. So it looks pretty dark, and just overall looking at this image, my goal was basically to try to capture as much of the sunset detail as possible. I couldn't quite get all of it without clipping any shadows of the couple. If you go into the develop panel and you press this J shortcut, it's going to pull up the clipping data. So the clipping data shows that I clipped a little bit on the highlight end and I have a little bit of shadows clipped, but it's just in the details of the clothes. And whenever you have something that you're trying to kind of sacrifice the photo and clip on one side or the other, typically it's better to clip something that's not the subject. But in this case, I just did it on the pants and the clothes right here, and that's not as big of a deal. What you really want to do is avoid clipping on the face if possible, or if you're trying to do just for the sunset detail, in that case, I would have tried to not clip the sunset. But generally, exposing to the right, which means trying not to sacrifice the shadows if at all possible, is the best case scenario. And basically, my overall goal for this edit is to make sure that I'm going to bring back as much of the kind of tones and details in the sunset that I can, and then just bring all this stuff back here. It's gonna be crazy. For those of you who've never seen kind of a raw edit before, it's probably really surprising and kind of like mind-blowing and almost like magic. So first thing that we're gonna do is I'm gonna apply my RPB color preset, and this is just my custom preset that I use in Lightroom to serve as a starting point. If you want to purchase this at the end of the video, check out the link down in the description below to purchase that. I actually have 50% off through the entire year of my ultimate preset, which comes with all these presets here. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do is going to bring the exposure back and just kind of do it pretty much just looking at the subject only. So don't really mind the background here, so we're going to bring it back. This is kind of good right here, and then we're going to bring back these shadows. This is where a lot of the heavy lifting comes. Because we shot it at ISO 160, you can pretty much get this without pretty much any sacrifice. So we're going to do that at push it up to 90, and then we're going to bring the highlights back down a little bit, just focusing again on the subject's face. Right here is pretty good. Now we're going to add some contrast in here, and then usually here's a good time to start adjusting the white balance. I'm just dialing in and just checking in the skin tones, just making sure it's not too orange, too blue, too purple, too green. Just do it to kind of my liking right here. And then I'm going to bring back dehaze, which just brings back kind of like a lot of the kind of like contrast in the photo. If it was basically, it's made so if you're shooting into sunflare, it brings all that contrast back. And then a little bit of clarity, which is just gives a little bit more kind of detail and mid-tone contrast for those, make things pop just a little bit more. All right, so we're looking pretty good right here, and now I want to kind of edit the skin tones just a little bit. Make sure it's not too much red skin tones in there. And here I go into the HSL panel and I adjusted the saturation just a little bit, and then the luminance, which takes care of like the brightness of these colors. I'm going to adjust the red luminance to go up a little bit, because the reds and the orange are what really control the skin tones. So now that we got that, it's looking pretty good. So what I'm going to do now is take a graduated filter, and what that does is add a gradient effect to the entire image. And just to show you what it's doing, I'm going to press O key, and that's going to bring over the overlay of where the image is actually getting darkened. And I'm going to just put it over here, and don't worry too much if it's over their faces. We're going to fix that in just a little bit. So press O again to get rid of that, and now we're going to adjust the exposure and bring it back down to recover that data back in the sky. So here you can see that we're bringing back a lot of the data in the sky. Maybe even drop down some of the highlights here. Nope, that's too much. Right there. So you can see how much the sky dramatically changes right here. And I'm sure you're gonna be like, oh well, the big problem here is that we're darkening the face of the couple here, and that's not a good thing. So what we're gonna do is actually turn on the luminance range mask right here. This is going to mask the image automatically to just focus on certain types of tones on the image. So here we're going to take the lower end and we're going to filter out the shadows and just focus only on the highlights of the image. And this is really where the tricks come out of my sleeve, so to speak. So here, and you're going to see now that it doesn't affect their faces as much. And that's really good. So let's move this up just a little bit. And then to finish that off, you want to actually click the brush tool, click erase, and make sure the auto mask is on. And we're going to press O again so we can see where the effect is. And you can just kind of brush it a little bit on here and just make sure it's totally off of their faces. And we can check out what the effect is like now. Back off that highlight recovery just a little bit, maybe. Sometimes you don't want to overdo it because then it looks unrealistic. And here I'm just taking care of the horizon line just a little bit because it looks a little obvious that it's burned just at the top. Okay, so now we're pretty much dialed in almost. And what I'm going to do is, so you're going to see that it's a little bit noisy, and that's because this is a limitation of a crop sensor camera. You're just going to have to kind of get over it and just accept that this is what it's going to be like. If you don't like how it looks, then don't do this technique because you're not going to get as clean of a file unless you're shooting with a full frame camera. And here what I'm doing is adjusting the masking of my sharpening. The key to sharpening Fujifilm files is make sure you put the radius at 0.5, detail at 0, amount between like 70 and 100. And basically you're going to take the masking and just mask off and remove any type of crazy amount of shadows that, or sorry, crazy amount of noise that you see in the background here. And then here we're going to add some noise reduction. Just a little bit. But, you know, for all intents and purposes, if you print this photo out or if you put it on the web, especially like on Instagram, no one's going to be able to notice. That's the truth. Like, you have to kind of accept that when you're shooting with a Fujifilm file. And you can do this technique again with any type of camera. So if you shoot with Sony, Canon, Nikon, you can recreate the same technique. The ISO, the histogram, all those things apply to any different type of camera. And I'm going to finish off the photo with one more kind of gradient filter just to kind of burn the edges of the image. This just kind of gives some type of a little bit of focus to the couple. Nothing too crazy, but I do this sometimes in as opposed to a vignette. Then now we can take a look at the before and after. And it's a dramatic difference. So I'm hoping you learned something new in this video. Please leave a comment down below if you have any questions about what I did or you have any comments or critiques. Again, if you want to purchase my preset, the links are down below in the description and there's 50% off for these presets for the entire year. As always, please be sure to subscribe if you haven't already, as I make a new Fujifilm or photography video every week. And if that's too long for you, I really encourage you to check out my Instagram. I've got a lot of tutorials on my Instagram at RegibPhoto, and I post new stuff every single day. Alright, that's it for me. Remember to get out, go shoot, and I'll catch you all in the next one.